Welcome everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's video we continue our exploration of Nginx, the warp-powered web server. So today's video we're going to cover making some changes to our Nginx default configuration. By default, the directory setup and host configuration files are a little bit non-standard in terms of what you're probably used to. And one of the things that's great about Nginx, much like Apache, is that you can change things around so that they're a little more familiar to you. So regardless of your distribution, if you're used to, for example, seeing your vhost files contained in sites available and then linked to sites enabled, we can set that up for Nginx. We can also externalize our vhost configuration in a directory called vhost.d, which is what we're going to do for CentOS 6 or 7. But again, you can follow the process based on your preferences simply by making the kinds of edits that we're going to be doing here. So as we talked about in our introduction to an installation of Nginx, if we move to our Nginx directory, our most important file is going to be the Nginx configuration file. And it's just most important because that contains the base configuration for everything on our Nginx system, including how it handles vhost configurations. So the first thing we'll do is let's make a change there. Let's go to vi nginx.conf. And within this file, we're just going to make one addition. We're going to go down to where it has the HTTP section right here. And in that HTTP section right now, it pulls in all of its configuration files for everything from etc nginxconf.d. All we're going to do is we're going to include another configuration directory. We're going to include nginx vhost.d. And we're going to say pull in all configuration files for that. Now this is simply where we're going to host all of our vhost configuration files. That way we can host one or more domains, and we can have those configuration files separate from either the nginx.conf file, which we could define within here, much like Apache. You can define your virtual host if you choose in httpd.conf, but that's less common, and for multiple websites that are hosted on your server, that can be a little more confusing. So your vhost directory, or in the case of Ubuntu or Debian, if you chose, you could put your site's enabled directory here, and then we would create vhosts and sites available and then link it to sites enabled. So depending on your distribution and your familiarity, you can set it up however you want. In our case, we're going to set up vhost.d. So let's go ahead and make a directory called vhost.d. And when we change to that vhost.d right now, our default configuration is contained from within our conf.d directory. So let's move what's in our conf.d directory, our default configuration, to here. And then we're going to make some changes to it. So this is just the bare basics default bucket for a vhost configuration, and we're going to go into the vhost configurations for Nginx in much more detail in a subsequent video. We're simply going to make a couple of quick changes here that support our configuration. So let's edit the default configuration. We'll do a vi on default, and all we're going to do is we're going to comment out this configuration file load here, because we're not going to use the default.d configuration directory. You can if you choose to, but in our case, we're simply going to use the vhost.d configuration that we changed before in the nginx.conf file. We're going to indicate that our root file system for our default instance is in the directory var www. And that's just because when you're managing a system, it's always nice to have some consistency as to where your web files might exist. And although there's nothing wrong with user share Nginx HTML, the vast majority of administrators, the first place they're going to look for a directory or file system that contains web files is going to be var www. That's been the Apache standard for some time. It's also the light HTTPD standard. So we're going to configure our system in the most generically familiar way possible, and then we'll have an idea how to manage the services once we discover that it happens to be Nginx. So now that we've made that change, we're not going to actually change the location of the 404 or the 500 errors. We'll go ahead and leave those in user share Nginx for now, so that they're actually going to serve content if necessary. In our case, if we decided to make changes to the default 404 pages, we could simply put that in the vhost here in this configuration. So all we've done is we've commented out the use of default.d, which we're not going to use, and we've changed the root file system for our default web server to be var www.html. So let's go ahead and do a save on that, and then let's create the directory var www.html. And once we've done that, we can simply echo a file out to it to check and see whether our configuration matches. Before we do that, let's do a links from our previous installation on the local host. And we see we have our default Nginx installation, including the index file that's at user share Nginx HTML. And the reason that we're doing that is I wanted to show that that's how it's configured now. And let's go ahead and edit this is our new config and index. And we'll just put it in var www HTML, and we'll call it index.html. That way we don't have to reset the index files or make any changes to that default configuration that indicates that that is a new file. So this is contained in var www.html. So one of the things that you're going to want to get into a habit of doing, especially with Nginx, as we get more advanced into proxy configurations in upstream hosts, is you're going to want to test your configuration before you implement it. That way you don't inadvertently stop a running file system or stop a running web server, and then when you're doing a restart, and then you go to reload the configuration and it's now not valid. So you'll always want to do an nginx-t, and you have to be logged in as root or sudoed to root to run this. And this will simply test both the configuration file itself, nginx.conf, and it will also test any configuration files that it has to load from within the nginx.conf file. In our case, the default.conf file. So if we go back into that default file, just as an exercise to show what would happen, and we add this is an error, and then we'll say it's an error, and we will save that to our configuration, and then we rerun the nginx-t. Then we get that there's an unknown directive in, and it will tell us etc nginx vhost.d.default.conf. That does two things. A, it did not restart the service, so that we haven't interrupted a configured and running system with a problem in a configuration change. And B, it tests the validity of the changes that we've made, as well as telling us exactly where it is. So it's not only verified that the changes that we made to nginx.conf shows that the configuration of vhost.d is being loaded, but whatever is in that file on line 7 is problematic and would cause the Nginx system itself not to load. So let's go ahead and go back in there, and then we'll just remove that line. And once we remove that line and save it, we should be able to execute nginx-t, and it will tell us the configuration syntax is okay and that it's successful. Now when we're using the Nginx service itself, there's a couple of different things that we can do for causing a reload. So if we do an Nginx stop, on the service is it's exactly that. It just shuts down as quickly as possible, dumping all the existing connections for our system. So anybody that's connected to our system will immediately receive an error. If they're in the middle of a transaction, it stops the connections. We can do an Nginx quit, which is a more graceful shutdown. It attempts to cleanly exit the sessions that are currently running or connected on the system. We could just do a reload, which doesn't affect existing connections, but will reload the configuration file. Or we could do a reopen, which is simply a closing and a reopening of the log files. That's useful if you're writing a script to, for example, rotate the log files. You just want to reopen the log files. It will close and allow the reopening of a log file after something has been done. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to do a service Nginx restart. We're going to be importing the new configuration file. We're not worried about existing connections, and we want to reload the entire configuration. Now, if we happen to be running CentOS 7, we would be doing a system control, system CTL, and a stop on the nginx.service. So once we restart that service, we should now be able to do a links HTTP localhost, and it should only tell us that this is our new config and index. So what we've done is we've made our Nginx configuration more familiar to a typical web server configuration, so that our files are in var www html, and we are loading our vhost configurations from vhost.d. And again, if you're more familiar or comfortable with a Debian or Ubuntu system, you could have just as easily created a systems available and sites available in a sites enabled directory, and then loaded from the sites enabled. It would work exactly the same way. In our subsequent videos, we're going to take a little bit more of an advanced look on how the vhost configuration differs in Nginx versus what you might be more familiar with in Apache. But that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.